Everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Stephanie Cernera. I'm a member of the postdoc and student committee of the BCI Society, and welcome to part 2 of our BCI-fi series. We have a great group of speakers here today to discuss their contributions to the BCI-fi field and also how to develop, foster, and publicize in BCI-fi. The speakers include Dr. Richard Ramchurn, a professor at the University of Nottingham and also the director of albino mosquito productions, Dr. Jane Huggins, a professor at the University of Michigan, Dr. Robert Hampson, a professor at Wake Forest University and also a science fiction writer, and last but not least, the BCI guys, Harrison Canning and Colin Fosnot, who are neurotech entrepreneurs, educators, and researchers. So thank you all so much for being here today, and I encourage the audience to use the chat function or Q&A function, and I'll get to your questions as soon as I can. And without further ado, we'll start with Dr. Ramchurn.
Hi. I'll just start my screen up. Does that work okay? So hi, my name's Richard Ramchurn. I'm a researcher and a director of movies, as well as other creative things. So I'm here today to talk to you about the 2 movies that I've made, which use BCIs to control the disadvantages of time travel and the moment.
Dr. Ramchurn, the screen is on the opposite display.
Thank you. And so can you see those 2 images? Is that working? Cool.
Looks good.
So I'm here to talk about the 2 films I've made, The Disadvantages of Time Travel and The Moment. So let's see. First of all, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I came to making brain-controlled movies. And it was a combination of 3 things, really. The first was a piece of research that I read by Shinji Nishimoto et al. Called, what was it? Reconstructing movies from visual content. And basically, in this research, people in fMRI machines were watching visual content. It was trailers from movies, and then post hoc recreated the video they were watching from brain data, and that really inspired me to imagine what could be possible in terms of creating film from people's brain data. The second piece of media that inspired me to make these things was the book by Walter Murch called In the Blink of an Eye. And he talked about people's inner emotions and thoughts becoming, well, the rhythms of these emotions and thoughts being insights to our inner selves, and that blinking could be a sign of these emotions and these thoughts. The third thing was the availability of commercially available BCI devices. And so I directed my first film using BCI called The Disadvantages of Time Travel. And it was a personal autobiographical piece exploring my tendency to daydream as a kid and how that bled into my childhood. And the film itself was mapped to attention and meditation from a Neurosky headset, and also the blink data that headset can pick up. So the film itself was split into dream and reality, and attention data would blend between these two realities. And meditation would mix the audio, and blinking would cut between 2 sets of narrative that were going through the film. I was making these as part of a PhD research, and I used the performance-led research in the wild approach by Benford et al. And with this, it's split into the artistic practice, studying that practice and building theory upon that, and this ecosystem of creating knowledge is proved like quite useful in my own creative context going onwards. And taking disadvantages out, just a few quotes from people who watched it. Some people found it quite uncanny that they were able to jump between the kind of the objective story and inside the character's head by just with their own brain data. And other people felt they had control over how the film was being made as they were editing it kind of in real time, especially if they watched it multiple times. They would see different parts of the film that they hadn't seen previously and come to understand how they were causing that interaction. The second movie was slightly higher scale. The Moment. It was a sci-fi thriller about, I suppose, the singularity and how you might circumvent it if it came to pass. With this film, I relied on another piece of theory from neurocinematics called event segmentation. And what this is when watching a film, there's a lot of research into why edits in films work when they're discontinuous visions of reality. We don't really see this outside of dreams, and March talks about that. But one reason is being given for why the edits in films work is this idea of event segmentation, and that there's neural signals that can be found when we segment action. For example, somebody filling up a car, the act of grabbing the nozzle, of putting it into the petrol hole, they are all separate actions that if you were filming it, they would be separate shots. And so I use this idea of creating an ongoing edit of the film, so each shot is a separate physiological signal. So this is, I was using attention data again from the Neuroscan headset, and looking at these peaks and troughs of attention, and looking at the points when attention peaks just after that, it will trough and then peak again. And in that period, that would be a shot of the film. It's quite interesting that these would roughly be around 6 seconds, which is very similar to how the 6 seconds being an average shot. 1 second. I'm just thank you. So the interactive video design, 3 narratives going throughout, and each scene would cut between 2 of these narratives. The story was written so that all the narratives happen concurrently. So whatever the edits happen between, it will make dramatic sense. And in terms of how many versions of the film, not taking into account how fast it's cutting and the ratio of how long it's spent on each of the different narratives, there's about 16.9 trillion different combinations that the film could be in. We screened it at a number of places, but did a study at a major UK film festival. The study consisted of 56 screenings. We've done a thematic analysis of it. The video there is taken from Arts Electronica in Austria, which I was getting screened in a caravan that we turned into a cinema. We drove over to Austria. I was also at a bunch of festivals across Europe, and features on a whole lot of TV and press and websites. supported by the Arts Council of England, University of Nottingham, and Horizon Digital Economy Research. People watching this film, what we're going for is less of an active control that you would get with a normal interactive movie, and more of unconscious control that some people liken to influence. And people had like a feeling of ownership over the version that they made. And we had a lot of repeat viewers. People would come back to see the film again to see how it would change on rewatching. And then find that by doing that, they would create new meanings or more meanings from the narrative as they further explored it. We also figured out like a taxonomy of control, where people might move from involuntary control through to voluntary control, and also being unconsciously aware of it, and to be fully conscious of it. And we find that these nice journeys through control happened, where people triggering awareness of the film would move them towards being aware of the control and being more creating more voluntary control. But when people find themselves falling into the flow of the film, they become unaware of the control. We found that this was like a lean back experience rather than lean forward, with such as like a video game, with a active understanding of the plot, especially with repeat viewing, and more of an editorial control rather than directorial. The viewers became the editors of the film, and that moves the power away from the auteurist director, more to the viewer. We also made a live score version of this, which toured Europe with the musicians playing live to an unknown version of the film. The next film we're working on is called Before You Disappear. It's using facial recognition to drive it. We'll have a brain control version as well. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's really cool. Awesome.
Yeah, so cool.
Never heard anything like that. Where did you get the idea? I might have missed it in the beginning.
Yeah. I was, as I said, this research by Shinji Nishimoto from Berkeley. We created video from brain data, and that gave me the concept of, right, okay, well, if our brain data is reflecting our experience, then that data could be used to create a new experience. And it's also my excuse to make sci-fi movies.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And for time reasons, we'll move to Dr. Jane Huggins. Thank you for being here.
Okay, I am hoping
Jane.
that, at our next BCI Society meeting in June of 2023, would this be a venue that you'll be presenting at? It sounds like it could be very interesting, and I'd like to try it.
Yeah, let's chat about that more over email. Maybe you could present some work at the next conference.
Okay, am I displaying a title slide that people can see?
You are.
Okay,
Yes.
I got the right slide up here then. So my talk is much less creative, perhaps. It's just riffing off the discussions that I had early on with Brendan about what is BCI-fi and why is BCI-fi and what is it useful for, and how does that relate to anything else that's going on in the world. So I'm looking at the BCI-fi or BCI-if, which incidentally works a lot better written than it does spoken when I've tried to tell my family what I'm talking about. And basically, I'm looking at this kind of loop between science fiction, and the technology that we create and how one drives the other. And, you know, I'm old enough to have seen the Star Trek communicators and then to have had the flip phone and all of these things. And so what we present with fiction is, you know, a what if. What if we made the world this way? What if we did that? What, you know, what might happen? What are the consequences? And, you know, Dr. Leuthardt was talking about this last time, and I didn't get his quote exactly, but it was something about walking people through the great things and the pitfalls of BCI. And I do find that I have processed a lot of, you know, what I think should be done and what shouldn't be done through the lens of different sci-fi that I've encountered. And sometimes I seek out the sci-fi on BCI, and sometimes or the real life stories of BCI, and sometimes I'm like, no, this is my entertainment time. I don't want to work on the thing that I work on. But the world building that we can create with fiction is really dramatic in letting us decide, where are we going? Where are we going with what are we doing? And I do find that when I read books, I tend to read series, not books. I also have trouble with distinguishing between what I have read and what I have seen. So I've talked to my kids about watching the episode and it was a book. So I can very much visualize these worlds and help use them kind of to look at the balance. What's the balance between what can we do and what should we do? And, you know, as an engineer and a scientist and a developer of assistive technology, I'm always trying to push that, what can we do? But I also want to keep in mind whether it's something I really think we should do. This is a book that is dear to my heart, and basically anyone who has worked in my lab has received a copy of it. It didn't look like that. I just, when I was Googling it, realized that this book was written the year I was born. And that's a really different cover than the one that I see it on now. But this is the first book in a series by Anne McCaffrey, and it's looking at you know, brain connections as enabling. It promotes the value of the mind, that the lead character was born with a disability, and because they could see from the EEG that she had intelligence, she was fitted to be the brain of the starship. And, you know, in this era, you know, the people whose physical bodies aren't working, they can, if they're caught at a young enough age, become the intelligence behind the starship or a city. And they've explored a lot of interesting issues through the series. I was reading that this is one of the worlds that Anne McCaffrey is the most proud of having created, but it's not one that she played in by herself very much. You could see that most of the other books in the series she co-authored with somebody else, and some of them she isn't even a co-author on. And, you know, there's a lot of interesting issues explored here. What about the cost of BCI? When Helga in the first book is given her starship, she also has the debt of the payment for all the surgeries that were required to give her that access. And so she has a certain number of years that she is expected to work for the company that did it. So there are questions of slavery and exploitation, and, you know, many different aspects get explored through this lens of fiction. What are the borders between human and machine? I don't want to do too many spoilers. But, you know, there's a case where there's a computer virus involved and they're like trying to cut off parts of themselves or what they considered parts of themselves, because that can be overtaken by the computer virus. So this was an early piece of fiction that I read and that I really adore and that I go back to. Another early piece of fiction that I read was Neuromancer. And this one I only read once. I didn't like the world that was created here, so I don't go live in that world. This did resonate with that culture of I can change myself that was mentioned last time, where, you know, people are putting, you know, getting cybernetic implants and getting different body parts and enhancements, but also some of the darker side, you know, mortgaging their body, working as sex slaves in order to pay for the upgrades. Though they can turn off their memory so they don't remember any of what they've had to do to pay for it. It's like, no, this is not a world I want to live in. Now, another fiction that I go back to repeatedly, of course, is Star Trek. And it's interesting how advanced and yet how not advanced they've been. And they're back in that loop. So, you know, if I were to play the clip that goes with this, you know, Captain Pike is all upset and he can blink yes and no on his lights, and that's all he can do. And Bones has this long, impassioned talk to Spock or to Kirk about how, you know, we could question him with weeks without figuring it out. And like, well, why don't you just hook it up to Morse code? He can say Spock is about to kidnap me. The episode can end. And but you know, they're missing something very key there, and yet they, you know, were way ahead of their time. Geordi is another person who has this brain interface technology, and his evolved over time. You know, that he needed, why he exactly needed the visor across the front is not completely clear or ever explained, but, you know, over the time he gets better tech and things improve. And then again, we come back to the questions of how voluntary might this be? You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. You know, where are we going with this technology? And another series that I enjoyed once, I may go back to it because it's very intriguing, is this Ancillary Mercy series. Though again, this is not a direction that I hope our BCI goes, because the artificial intelligence is taking over the bodies of humans to provide its ancillaries and destroying the personality of the humans. And there's interesting blends of autonomy and control, and it is an interesting, fascinating world they have created. But again, it becomes that question of what kind of world do we want to create? What kind of world shall we build? And do our individual decisions actually matter in that? So, you know, the BCI-fi, BCI-if, using our fiction to explore the ethics, you know, let's think about whether the directions that we're going are actually the directions that we want to be going. So those are my musings on BCI fiction and what we should learn from it, and some of my most interesting fictions that I have encountered. So maybe we have time for discussion, at least nobody jumping in and telling me that we have to move on to the next speaker.
I had a quick question.
Certainly.
Do you find that these questions that these books pose to influence your research?
Sometimes. My research is very squarely in the voluntary use of brain-computer interfaces as an output device to operate technology for people with disabilities. So I have located my BCI area of study in the area that I see the most need and the least pitfalls. And very early on, during my PhD career and before I actually graduated, I went for a long walk with myself to say, where could this go? Do I want to go where it could go? And, had made some decisions at the time that I do want to stick to the voluntary control, that I'm not intrigued by enhancement for get ahead of other humans. I'm intrigued by there are people who so desperately need this. And even the very limited, I have another talk where I say, the world is designed for quick, precise movements. There are people who can't move at all. With BCIs, you can help people to make slow and imprecise movements. Whether movements or selections or communication, it's still slow and rather imprecise. But there are people for whom that's such a big improvement over what they have now. I've given talks where I've said, look, this is just so slow, and had people say, yeah, but it looks faster than my loved one can do. So yes, it has informed which directions I've gone.
Thank you for sharing. I'm always curious to see.
Well, it goes back to that question of, maybe we do need the killer app that everyone will want in BCI in order to get the tech cheap enough that the people who really need it can use it. There's a lot of everybody's in the world, and I am concerned about those questions of, all the different places that are spinning by in this globe. And yes, if anybody's watching closely, I flipped it because I wanted the world on the left-hand side. So this is the world spinning backwards, but it also seemed kind of apropos. But, when I look at all those different areas, the question of the cost of any of these things is a really big question. And, for BCI, I've had funding agencies or I've had investors say, well, there's not a big enough market. There aren't enough people who need BCI. Well, praise God, there aren't enough people who need the degree of slow, imprecise BCI that we can currently provide. The world does not need more people with that level of need. The world needs a BCI that will provide something that they can use. And then maybe it expands beyond that.
Well, to some extent, it is expanding beyond that, in that, Jane and I have been discussing and agreeing on this point for decades, that BCIs are classically used for a very small audience, and that it would seem necessary for them to appeal to a larger audience to push the price down and also to advance the technology and things like that. But you also have this emerging field of what Walpole would classify as enhancement or restoration, like, for example, BCI for stroke rehabilitation, right? Where in this case, it's not a killer app for everybody. I don't have one. I would not benefit from one.
And you
It's
don't
really
want to have one.
And I don't want to have one.
But you're glad it might be there if you need it.
I'm glad it, not only if I might need it, but if I want to study it for my career, it's interesting. It's a good direction to be in. But you see the broader point, which is that the advancement toward more widespread BCI might not necessarily require a BCI for everybody. It might be instead that you see more and more BCIs for specific groups, like people with stroke, that are much larger than the target groups that Jane and I have classically worked with, that would also advance the field. And I'm curious to see, how and which direction.
we have any questions in the chat? I haven't been looking.
There is not, but for time's sake, I think we're going to move to Dr. Hampson.
Okay.
But thank you for the discussion.
There's the button.
There. Hi, hello. I'm Rob Hampson. I'm at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. I am going to share my splash screen here. And okay, so do we have my title slide up there? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking, we mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago that one of the great examples of BCI-fi is a $6 million man. And I am one of those kids of the 70s who grew up with $6 million man. Went off as a 19-year-old college graduate, said, I'm going to get into bionics. And so I went off to a university where I knew somebody was working on prosthetics, only to find out that they were working on different metal alloys for artificial knee joints. And that was the extent of it, because it was 1979 and the field did not exist yet. But about 8 years ago, I was at a DARPA meeting, DARPA Neurotech, where we were combining several different programs, including revolutionizing prosthetics, the RP3 program. And at that meeting, we had a number of practical demonstrations of BCIs, including Johnny Matheny, who is the volunteer with a fully articulated forearm prosthetic. And I looked around the room and said, you know, these are the people, this is the field that didn't exist 25 years ago. And it's just amazing to have watched it develop. So I've spent a fair amount of time in the past couple of years looking into what it would take to update the concepts and the story of the $6 million man. And I've put a few of my affiliations here. Let me see if I can get this to advance now. So Martin Caidin wrote his book, Cyborg, in 1972. And in 1974, we saw the TV program, The $6 Million Man, which was based on that book. Now, in the book, Steve Austin is an astronaut who is very badly injured and involuntarily rebuilt by a super secret agency to be a spy. And in the TV show, they kind of downplayed that a little bit, but the major intent was for him to be a spy. And in the books by Caidin, he was actually an assassin. And I didn't ever really particularly like that idea. So I said, you look around at who has BCIs, who uses BCIs in current science and in current society. These are all volunteers. I mean, that's one of the things that Jane and Brendan have just been talking about. These are all volunteers, and they're people in ordinary professions. So how do we get from the idea of a super secret agency that has invested $6 million into rebuilding their cyborg to how can we bring BCIs to the general public? Now, the whole concept of bionics actually comes from Jack Steele, who was an engineer and doctor who was looking at various ways to improve technology, improve engineering, and improve humans' abilities to function in space. Now, a lot of this takes place in the late 50s and 60s before humans had actually gotten to space. And the Air Force Research and Development Command at Wright-Patterson had a group that was looking into how do we use biology to inspire our engineering, our electronics, in order to improve the ability of humans to operate in space. So Steele's original portmanteau of biology and electronic was his concept with things like solar panels that could unfold themselves just like the petals of a flower unfold themselves with the morning sun, or ways to develop a hard shell like a turtle or a crab to protect a human. Now, the others, researchers at Air Force Research, were also looking at things like how could we augment humans in order to make them function better in space. And so that is how the term bionic, which was simply biologically inspired engineering, became associated with prosthetics. So here's our $6 million man. We can rebuild him, right? We've got the technology to create a fully articulated arm, fully articulated legs, eyes. In case of bionic woman, she had a bionic ear. Interestingly, Caden went with the arm and the legs. He did not go with the bionic eye. In the book Cyborg, Steve Austin's eye was a camera. And later it was a laser illuminator, but it was not a fully functional eye. But in the TV show, this is science fiction. This is BCI-fi, so we go with a bionic eye. So can we rebuild him with our current state now that there actually is a field called bionics, or at least neural prosthetics? Can we rebuild our $6 million man? And the answer in part is yes. Because for lower limb prosthetics, we have found that it is not always necessary to have full neural control. Passive and mechanically reactive prosthetics, such as running blades that are worn by partial amputees, enable them to do so many different things, such as running. We know the case of Oscar Pistorius, a South African runner who had 2 artificial legs, and they were both fitted with running blades, and he was making world record times on artificial legs. And we have our picture here of Johnny Matheny, who has a neurally controlled, fully articulated bionic arm. And one of the neat things about Johnny is Johnny can disconnect that arm. And when he's using the Wi-Fi version, the wireless version of his interface, he can disconnect the arm, he can hold it out, and he can shake your hand with it. He can curl the fingers around, he can command it. Well, we've long asked him if it's possible to do that whole thing like the Thing from Addams Family, where the hand crawls across the table. And he says, no, it's just not strong enough to do that, but he can wiggle the fingers and he can move the wrist and all of that. And he has a couple of interfaces. He has the one that you see right here, which is picking up signals from nerves that have been surgically relocated to lie just underneath the skin. And that interface is wireless. He also has one that's wired, and he has a couple of hours of battery power a day. As far as our $6 million man, we kind of have to hand wave our power supply so far. But here's some possibilities. Now, with Johnny's hand, he doesn't have touch feedback. That was actually the next iteration that was under development when DARPA finished out the revolutionizing prosthetics program. But I believe there is a version of the Luke arm, which is one that is commercially available to the public. It is the cost of it's reimbursable by Medicare and insurance. And there is a version of that has limited touch feedback, and there's been a lot of research. So we're progressing to the point of having Steve Austin's bionic arm. Not quite to the point where it looks fully natural like a human, but we're getting there. But there's other aspects in which the answer is just maybe. The bionic eye right now is not something. There is research being done with direct visual cortex stimulation, but one of the best, most advanced prosthetics was a retinal prosthetic called the Argus 2, developed by Second Sight. And with that, an external camera signal is fed to an electrode that sits on the retina. For patients that have lost their photosensitive cells, their rods and cones, but still have the intact neural structure of the retina, it's possible to stimulate that directly and give a rudimentary sense of light, dark, edges, points, and in at least one instance of a 10 by 10 array of electrode stimulation, could read one letter at a time, could discern and detect one letter at a time. Unfortunately, this product has been discontinued, and it raises a very ethical, very interesting ethical point for Jane to continue and incorporate in some of the studies, is what do we do with a person who has bionics when they become obsolete or when they need an upgrade? Because the case of the Argus 2 patients is very sad. This is a device that is no longer being supported. So this is now, where do we move to with developing the next phase of our BCIs for our $6 million man? We need more patients. We need to address more disorders and more brain functions. And fortunately, the research is going out there. So I'm showing cochlear implants, and cochlear implants are now being placed in all ages. Folks who have loss of hearing at an advanced age, and children who've been born without it. And we have a number of, we have more patients. We're looking at the application of deep brain stimulation to not just movement disorders, but anxiety, obsessive compulsive, and deep brain stimulation is now being used for memory, for the potential for a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, which happens to be the area in which my research takes place. And we're looking at the possibility of brain-computer interfaces as consumer and entertainment products. We heard about the NeuroSky brainwave kit, which Dr. Ramchurn mentioned is in use for the control aspect of his movie. We see the Cognionics has a BCI speller, and I point this one out because this is a dry EEG head cap that can be oriented in about 2 minutes. The patient can, or the subject can don this head cap and be controlling the BCI in about 2 minutes without a lot of setup and adjustment. Now, granted, they've trained it before, but in terms of walking in and being able to use it, this speller is getting very close to being a consumer product. And of course, we know that a technology has arrived when it's incorporated into toys. I mean, who hasn't used a laser pointer to tease their cat? And, you know, laser pointer, that's a very high-tech device. But there are now versions of a detector like the NeuroSky incorporated into cat ears, that the cat ears will wiggle depending on a person's mood. So for recreation and cosplay, we see BCIs coming as a consumer product. In literature, a book that came out last year by Larry Currie and John Brown called Gunrunner used a BCI speller. And the interesting part about that is, when I read it, is I knew exactly what the inspiration for it was, because Larry and one of his sons, one of his daughters had come and visited the Society for Neuroscience meeting. And we walked him through the vendors so he could get some ideas for his science fiction writing. And his daughter donned a headset and operated a BCI speller. And so it was amazing. He's sitting there going, this is absolutely fantastic. I can't believe this. 3 years later, it shows up in his fiction. So there is really an interesting place for BCI-fi being inspired by the science as well as the science inspiring the fiction. So I've been taking a look at this whole idea of the $6 Million Man. I've actually written my own version, which will come out next March. And we look at, in the course of it, we've got 50 years of progress from the original thoughts of having a fully bionic person. We've got brain-computer interfaces now. We don't even have to use an electrode on the brain surface for control if we can use peripheral nerves to control our bionics. The material science, we have ceramic composites instead of steel and titanium for bone. We could use electrostatic polymer membranes in place of muscles. But one of the other updates for $6 Million Man is to be realistic. There is no way our Steve Austin is jumping over a building or lifting a car on his own when he still has biological skin, muscle, and bone. But what could we actually get? Maybe about 15, 20% greater than an elite athlete. And more important than that is taking a look at the psychology of the bionic volunteer. The biggest question that I see for BCI in the future is going to be, when do we as a society allow a person to walk into their doctor's office and say, put a chip in my brain? Because right now that's limited to people who have a medical need. But when do we make it so that that can be strictly voluntary? And that's my point right now. We are making the point where science is inspiring science fiction, but the science fiction inspired the science. And so it's a really neat circle that we can use moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to move on to Colin and Harrison because there's 10 minutes left, but if there's time for discussion at the end, we can definitely talk about your presentation in more in-depth.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you for having us speak. We've always looked to BCI Society as a leader in the field for discussion. So it's very fun to be able to speak at this event. And we've also always seen BCI-fi as a great way to talk about and have a conversation about neurotechnology and brain-computer interfaces, which is what we're all about, as we'll get into in a minute. So it's a very cool event. So I'm Harrison, and this is Colin, and together we create educational, easy to understand and entertaining content on YouTube, and also other social media platforms as well, to try to get people in a little bit more in our backgrounds. In undergrad, which I just recently graduated from last spring, I studied neurotechnology, and I also do work for BlackRock Neurotech right now.
Yep. I'm Colin. Nice to meet you guys. I graduated from RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, in 2019 for software engineering. I also worked as an intern at OpenBCI in 2016, and I taught a class on brain-computer interfacing at RIT in 2020. Harrison and I met in 2018, and we formed the first student-led research group at RIT called the Neurotechnology Exploration Group. We were fortunate enough to go to lots of maker fairs, and we actually went to Dubai's maker fair. And one of the questions that we kept getting asked at these maker fairs was, obviously we would bring all these different experiments, like EEG experiments that run robotic prosthetics and robot cars and play Mario, that sort of thing. Super simple hackathon type projects. And one of the questions we kept getting asked by everybody was, do you have a YouTube channel? And at the time, I don't think we fully appreciated just how important that question was. But in 2020, when the pandemic hit, we actually started BCI Guys, which is our YouTube channel where we make informative, educational, and most importantly, entertaining content related to brain-computer interfacing. Our goal is to sort of be the mouth of this funnel, right, for neurotechnology. We found that once people start getting interested, or once people are actually exposed to brain-computer interfaces and to neurotechnology in general, they're incredibly interested in the tech, and they actually do want to dig deeper into it. But the biggest problem that we found is, how do you expose people to it? Like, how do you get it out there? How do you get people as excited about it as Harrison and I are? And one of the ways that I mentioned that we did that is we have been doing that, is by making our content entertaining, first and foremost. So here's like an example from a course that we put together called Neurotech EDU. We'll talk about that more in a second. But there's like a little skit, of just, silly moments that keep the viewer interested in the content that you're creating, or that we're creating rather. We have quite a few videos right now that have been kind of popping off lately. We're very excited about. The most recent of which is a sponsored video by BlackRock Neurotech, which we're super happy to have. That's just comparing BlackRock Neurotech's device to Synchron Stentrode. We also have done, little experiment videos in the past, like project-based videos. So we used the Unicorn Hybrid Black from G-Tech to control video games with a P300 response. We also used their device to do like a Tinder swiper. So the idea was, like, theoretically you could detect like a P300 response if you theoretically find somebody attractive. And we use that concept to create like a Tinder swiper that basically swipes right or left, depending on who you're interested in from that P300. And then at the bottom right, we have obviously the Neurotech EDU course, which is available for free on our YouTube channel. And we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that here later.
Yeah, and that brings us to BCI-fi and how that integrates, because all of our content is about trying to, like Colin said, get people into the mouth of that funnel and then interested in neurotech so that they can join the industry and start with that discussion. And our very first video featured the Matrix. And again, this is wonderful because people are familiar with these concepts, and this allows us to start to teach people about the technology that underlies this. So we use BCI-fi and science fiction in general a lot to help teach some of these concepts.
Gotta love the COVID beard I have here in this video.
Yeah, that was mid 2020. And then also, so this is in an ethics video that we did that was entirely driven by sci-fi. So we would find different examples of ethical violations, or in some cases, responsible ethics around neurotech, and then use that to help people understand why some of these things are worth having a conversation about, so that we can avoid dystopian futures. And BCI-fi largely drives the environment with which we all speak about neurotechnology within, because again, in public discourse, the knowledge and perception is largely driven by sci-fi. And a lot of times that means that people are scared and skeptical and often misinformed about what technology is out there. We get comments and messages and even one handwritten letter pretty frequently about people's concerns about the fields, and there's a lot of thirst for more knowledge about this. So that's kind of where we come in to try to help correct some of those perceptions, but also say some of these are worth having a conversation about. So BCI-fi is really great for that. And one thing that we see over and over again, a couple of the points that we like to hit, is this idea of social justice within neurotechnology, because obviously the technology is quite expensive to develop out right now and will continue to be for a while. And so it's worth noting that people that are more affluent will be the ones that have access to this technology. And you have examples like Iron Man, which is sort of like a neurotech BCI controlled suit. And obviously Tony Stark has significant advantages. If you imagine if he was in a fist fight with somebody off the street, he would have a clear advantage because of the financial access that he has.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And sort of building off that idea, of even equipment or whatever that somebody who has access to this technology could have. Theoretically, as this technology advances, there's potential for things like cognitive advancement, right? So like increasing the ability that somebody has to learn quickly. So maybe you can learn 20% faster if you have an implant or whatever. Well, how do we distribute that technology in a way that is sort of equitable throughout the society without creating a sort of bigger gap than already exists in terms of like the haves and the have-nots, right? Like theoretically, you could have an entirely separate class of people who have devices that allow them to learn quickly and have perfect memory and all that stuff. And we just want to have a discussion about that now before the technology is actually there. And also making sure that people understand what these devices do, right? So like one of the biggest problems in the matrix with the matrix is that all these guys are all these people are lined up and plugged into this simulator, but there's been they're not made aware of the fact that they're in the simulation, right? So it's really important for us to have these discussions now while brain computer interfaces are sort of out of the realm of common everyday occurrences, to get ahead of that discussion and hopefully shape some of the movement of these devices as they're released onto market.
Yeah, and there's a really wonderful exhibit right now that we want to give a shout out to over at MIT called Neurofutures, and they catalog, I think it was like 400 pieces of sci-fi media that involve brain-computer interfaces in some way. You can find it at neurofutures.com. And it's really wonderful. They actually made, you can see over her shoulder there, like physical versions of some of the BCI-fi tech that you see. So really wonderful. And they also have done some analysis on how long it takes. So we'll be doing a series with them soon, but just worth a shout out if you're really interested in sci-fi. Another thing that we've been working on for a while is, again, in this idea of creating conversation around neurotech, is something called We Are Neurotech, which is where we've interviewed or asked for video clips from neurotechnologists across the spectrum, from enthusiasts and students getting into it to seasoned researchers, and ask them simple questions like, what do you do within neurotech? But we've found some of the most exciting ones to be, what are your favorite sci-fi pieces of media, and how does that influence the work that you do? And then my all-time favorite question is, what is your definition of a cyborg? Because that is so murky for people, and the definitions range all the way from something that looks like RoboCop, which is sort of Hollywood's interpretation of a cyborg, where you can see like part man, part machine. And then on the other end of the spectrum, people say that we're already cyborgs when you use a smartphone. And the farthest one that I got on that spectrum was anytime you use a tool, you're a cyborg. In fact, non-humans can be cyborgs as well. She gave the example of a bird using a stick to build a nest, and she said that was a cyborg, which I absolutely love. So it's really quite a range, and it's fun to see where that goes.
Once again, I want to plug the Foundations of Neurotechnology course. This is a free course that we have hosted both on YouTube, on our YouTube channel at the BCI guys, as well as on Neurotech EDU's website, where we have a bunch of written content there as well. Totally free course where we cover everything from broad overview of what neurotechnology is to neuroanatomy, and even discuss ethics and philosophy within neurotechnology. So if you're interested, or you know anybody who might be interested in learning more about neurotech, but don't really know what to start in terms of like where to give, what information to give them to, start looking through, this is really easily digestible videos and written content that we recommend for anybody who's sort of interested in the field and wants to get started. Make sure to check
And
us out on
there's
YouTube.
a ton of sci-fi in there as well. I just want to
Yes,
mention that. Yeah, go
yes.
ahead.
Make sure to check us out on YouTube at the BCI guys. We also have a podcast that's on a temporary hiatus right now that we're working on getting started back up here, called called the Brainstream podcast. So check us out, and yeah, I think we can take any questions now.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much, and thanks for taking the time to develop a platform like this. I would have appreciated it. Growing up,
Well, that's what we thought too, right? It's like when we
Yeah.
first started, there's no resources like this for like undergraduates, basically, or
Yeah.
high school kids, right? So our goal was to make just this stuff just easily digestible, so that people don't have to read through all these scientific papers when they're freshmen in college,
Yeah. We've always found like neurotech, when you first start, or maybe you see those first videos and want to get interested, it can be really intimidating, because it's like, do I study neuroscience or electrical engineering or software? Like, what do I do? And that's part of the reason why we want to do We Are Neurotech as well, is just to say, like, really, if you're interested, you can approach this from any angle. Even if you're like a product designer, like, you can help out in some way as well. Like, everyone can contribute something. So it's important to emphasize that.
Yeah, and it's awesome. Congratulations. Really great work.
Thank you very much.
And we are a bit over time, but I wanted to check if there was any last minute comments or questions from the panelists to one another. If not, thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you for sharing your experiences with BCI-fi. It was so nice to have everyone here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Take care.
Thank
Very
you.
cool
Have a
talks,
great
guys.
day.